Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to the second part of our Invest Africa Youth Investment discussion. Last week we looked at the youth dividend. Tonight we continue the discussion and focus in on entrepreneurial activity on the continent. Still with me, my guests in Johannesburg, Nola Mashaba. She is a Mandela Washington Fellow and is part of the Young African Leaders Initiative. We also have Thabi Leoka. She's the South African economist at RentCap, and we have Mabutho Mthembu, KPMG manager responsible for corporate citizenship and tax. He's also the chairman of Youth Managers South Africa. Now, for you at home, please do join the conversation by using Twitter and following me at Nozipho Mbanjwa or at CNBC Africa. And don't forget to use our hashtag, which is Invest Africa. Remember that we still have our live studio audience. They'll be posing questions and taking the panel through their paces. But before they do that, let me get my turn and maybe start off with you, Thabi. We spoke a lot about the challenges and the prospects for youth on the continent last week. What role can entrepreneurship play in solving some of these problems?
A huge role. If you look at or at least the major developed markets, it is small and medium-sized enterprises that actually grow an economy. And that's how we should be growing our economy, through small and medium-sized enterprises. And I think that the youth have been on the continent sidelined. We have traditionally, I think that we are quite a patriarchal society or continent, and it has become quite difficult for the youth to actually penetrate business industries. And since now we are 43% of African countries, at least have huge number of young people, and I think it's time for young people to take charge. One way of doing so is entry to reducing the barriers to entry, making sure that youth are involved in every industry. Last week we had the Kenyan lady saying that Kenya has initiatives on every tender has set aside youth.
30% participation.
30% participation.
Yes.
That's very impressive and very high. I think that many of our countries can learn from that. The youth are more energized, more innovative. If you look at Silicon Valley, yes. It is controlled by young entrepreneurs.
Or Silicon Savannah now, as we have in
exactly.
Nairobi.
And if you look at if you look at the NASDAQ, a lot of the companies there are run and owned by young people. So it is, there's a lot of opportunity for young people on the continent. We just need to reduce barriers of entry and promote young people to be involved in new business initiatives on the continent.
Mabutho, developments in South Africa, we've seen the establishment of the Small and Medium-Sized Enterprise Ministry. Some have said that this is absolutely unnecessary. In fact, if you want entrepreneurial activity to flourish, you just need to let entrepreneurs get on with it without setting up another layer of bureaucracy. Which side of the fence are you on, and where do you see the most support for young people coming from?
I think the challenge that we have experienced in South Africa is that the government has put in place in the past institutions to focus specifically on supporting entrepreneurs. But the reality is that the success rate of those institutions has been very disappointing. And the reality is that the government needs to play a very important role in supporting entrepreneurs. Now, for instance, in this country, we've got a high level of unemployment, and entrepreneurship has been singled out as one of the, of the pillars to, to support the country to deal with unemployment. And therefore, the reality is that if we continue setting up, institutions and so forth that will not have teeth to deal with the challenges that are facing entrepreneurs, then we'll run in a risk of actually just putting all that investment into waste. There's a whole host of challenges that entrepreneurs face, which is access to market, barriers to entry, and so forth. So this should not just be a government issue. The government should ensure that the institutions that they are putting in place are effective and functioning properly and supporting the entrepreneurs. And the private sector as well, I think, needs to play a role in terms of actually sort of mentoring the entrepreneurs that are coming into into the economy, because there is a whole host of challenges that that they encounter.
Now, Nola, we have domestic interventions and we have international interventions. You've had direct experience in one of the international interventions as a Yali. Do you get a sense that there's a clear understanding of what the needs on the ground are for African entrepreneurs?
If I were to use the experience from the US, over 70% of the economy is driven by entrepreneurs, small and medium businesses. To the example that you have also mentioned, about 30% of the tender businesses will be going to the youth. They are also doing the same thing, especially when it comes to the private sector. They're concentrating on 5% every year. They're building up for entrepreneurs. So we more or less have similar strategies that we can employ here back at home in South Africa as well. But yes, we can have strategies for entrepreneurs to grow. We need to have access to capital because that is the biggest barrier. Tenders are easy because they come in with the money. But at the same time, we have other entrepreneurs who are creating their own innovations. And therefore, there might not be a tender that will look up into that. But if someone wants to start this business, it might just be killed because someone doesn't have access to the relevant financing. So to an example of, yes, you can teach someone how to fish so that they can feed themselves, but you also need to give themselves tools of that they're going to use to actually fish and make sure there's access to market with the real capital that they need to make their dreams a reality.
Thabi, I want us to latch on to the point that Nola makes now about capital. Where's the problem exactly? Is there a lack of capital that funds young entrepreneurs, or is there sufficient capital but young people do not have access to that capital? Where's the problem?
I think we don't have enough or sufficient funding. If you look at South Africa as an example, it is, I think, one of the biggest problems that a lot of young entrepreneurs find is that they don't have capital. So they may have bright ideas, but they don't. It's difficult for them to access capital. I think banks in South Africa, and I would expect banks all over the continent, have very high criteria and very strict criteria, which makes it almost impossible for very young people who are inexperienced, who don't have a track record, who require a surety to access or to get capital from banks. We do, though, have the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We have other agencies that we can use.
That brings me to the next question, and I want to keep that question with you, and that is our development finance institutions filling the gap sufficiently? Because on the one hand, you've got this risk profile that makes young people so unattractive, but we've got a space here that DFIs can play in. Are they playing the space? Are they filling the gap?
Not sufficiently, because the DVSA still uses the same criteria as your banks. Your IDC, Industrial Development Corporation in South Africa, still requires the same standards, or applies the same standards to young people as it does to experienced or established companies. And that really needs to stop, because we need to, in order for us to promote entrepreneurship, we need to have access to capital. I think one way of doing it is, in South Africa, we now have the Ministry of Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, which I think is it's a great new ministry. But at the same time, my suggestion is that maybe the ministry should be should be the surety. So they should back young people.
So they should guarantee
loans.
Yeah.
And then, but for the banks. So young people should approach banks, and the government or through other finance initiatives should back young people. And in that way, government has a way of ensuring that these companies do not collapse, because they obviously have a vested interest in it. And at the same time, they also have a vested interest in making sure that these companies are successful and return, return on investment.
So the loan guarantees, in essence, are going to ensure that you have increased capital available without necessarily making the capital cheaper. Mabutho, I want us to talk about this growth of incubations and incubated ideas. I'm also finding that there's a gap between taking those ideas to scale. Do you get a sense that we're following through with young people? So we're giving them access to finance, we're incubating their ideas, but are we actually allowing those ideas to then flourish into full-blown businesses?
Yeah. I think the challenge is that if you look, for instance, at the governmental institutions that are focused on supporting entrepreneurs, I think my view that where the problem lies is in terms of identifying the business ideas that will flourish in the market. And that's why my view is that those institutions should actually be staffed with competent and well-skilled entrepreneurs, because it starts at the identification phase. So for instance, if you do not have skilled people who are going to go out to young people in the market and come back to the institution and fund businesses that will not even fly because they lack the experience to actually identify workable businesses in our market, then you will run a risk where the government institutions will start operating like the private institutions and so forth. So it needs to start at the identification stage, so that, but that can only be done by people who have been through the system and who understand what entrepreneurship is about. So I believe if we could do that, implement that process, then we'll be in a position to actually have some results from these institutions.
I've got less than a minute before we go to break, so I want to quickly pose this to you two ladies. Venture capitalists in particular, one would think that the macroeconomic fundamentals of the country where the entrepreneurs are operating will play a big role on whether a venture capitalist will come in and actually put their money behind a particular entrepreneur. Thabi, let's start off with the lack of IPOs that we see on the African continent. Do we have financial markets that are deep enough to attract foreign capital so that young entrepreneurs actually have a fighting chance?
Unfortunately, we don't. I mean, the more mature markets are still your South Africa, your Ghana, your Nigeria, and getting capital into the country or into the continent is still very, very difficult. I think Africa still has this perception of being quite a dangerous or risky place to go. And remember that we're also competing with other emerging markets as well. And we need to just be cognizant of that. How, you know, in terms of what's going on even in Nigeria, the investor who's sitting in Europe may perceive it to be a lot more dangerous than us here on the continent, and may not be willing to put in their money in the same way as an African investor wanting to invest in another African country.
In 10 seconds, is Brand Africa failing the young entrepreneur?
No. There's a lot of opportunity.
That's all the answer that I need. It's time for us to take a quick break, but when we come back, more from our panel and audience looking at youth entrepreneurship on the African continent. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're still watching Invest Africa. We are in part 2 of our youth investment discussion, and this week we are focusing on youth entrepreneurship. If you want to be a part of the conversation, follow me at Nozipho Mbanjwa or at CNBC Africa, and don't forget that our hashtag is Invest Africa. Let's go to the floor now for our first question/comment.
My name is Matsatsavale Wagatliane, and mine is not a question, it is a comment. I'd like to believe that we as young people need to start identifying ourselves as people that need not be on the receiving end. We need to start taking ourselves very seriously. And we also need to tackle this issue of concentration as young entrepreneurs in what I would term glamorous ventures. We need to get dirty. I'm running a pest control company with my father. We go and we prevent and we kill pests. So, and there's also this mismatch of what the education system produces and what the economy demands. So we also need to tackle such things. We need to take ourselves seriously as young people and not be on the receiving end.
Young people as active change agents. Let's take our second question.
Hi, I'm Shelley from KPMG, and I work in the Africa high growth markets. And what we know and we see as Africa as the new growth frontier. 5-10 years ago, we really saw businesses coming into the continent and taking as much as they could out of the land and not putting back and not investing in local talent. Is this really still the case? Or is private sector reinvesting back into the continent? And has government made enough and effective structural enablers to help entrepreneurs really achieve their aspirations?
Thank you, Shelley. Let's take the next question, which is right next to you.
Okay, my name is Femi Oke. I'm from KPMG Nigeria. I work with KPMG South Africa here. I want to bring to the focus agriculture, youth agriculture. What are we doing about it? How are we actually investing into this? 60% of arable land are here in Africa. How can the youth participate in this and make this grow for Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's take the final question coming from the floor.
My name is Keith Mosomani. My question is directed to the gentleman. He says he does leadership development in the youth in the rural areas. So I come from a company, it's called Bergane Commit Project. So we focus on education, water and sanitation, and leadership development within the community in Polokwane, outside Polokwane. So I just want to know, how do we access your service or whatever that you're doing, so that we'll be able to get that so that we can take it to our community as well?
Thank you very much. So let's maybe, Nola, let's get you taking on the first question, which is really, are we seeing the relationship between Africa and our foreign trading partners changing in favor where these foreign companies are actually directly investing in the continent and in the people of this continent?
Thank you, Nozipho. The main discussion that is currently taking on now is that, one, yes, Africa is growing. Africa has the investment opportunities that everyone is interested in. And yes, there is quite a high FDI that is currently available to invest into Africa. But gone are the times when investors will come into the continent and take whatever it is that they want and leave you with nothing, and then they leave the respective countries after they have acquired however much wealth they would have needed to take. Because now it's time for us to be wise as Africans to say whatever it is that we need from these deals and be able to stand in a position of negotiating what is equally ours. We need to get into this as equal partners that is beneficial for both parties. Yes, we're no longer working like in the past where someone will come and just take whatever they want and leave, but we have to negotiate on equal terms as partners.
That's a great question, great response. Let's move on to agriculture, Thabi, and that's again a question coming from KPMG.
I'd also just like to to answer the first question, only because I feel that we haven't spoken about this, but for entrepreneurship to happen and for youth development to take place, we need strong institutions and we need to get rid of corruption. And as long as we have weak institutions and corruption, we will continue to have participation or participants on the continent who will come here and do what they have to do and leave without developing the local communities, without reinvesting into the local communities. Another thing, that we are the wealthiest in terms of minerals in the world, African countries, and yet we export everything, and we export raw materials and we import finished goods. That needs to stop. And we need to have, back to institutions, back to governments, we need to have policies that ensure that we beneficiate. So instead of exporting iron ore to China, we need to start exporting finished goods and beneficiating on the continent, which will also involve youth to participate in the creating of products that we ship out. And we also need to have policies that support this. China, for instance, you know that you can't, China does not allow the importation of finished goods, but yet they want importation of, let's say, iron ore, raw material. We should also reciprocate. Why are we sending out iron ore to China only to buy back at international prices steel and rods And so that needs to change as well. On agriculture.
Before you move on to the second question, I want to take a step back. I mean, you spoke quite eloquently on the issues, especially around corruption. And it goes back to that earlier point that I raised about whether we're cleaning up our act in terms of repolishing brand Africa. Is there enough change on the African continent? And I'm not talking about a cosmetic change, but is there enough change at an institutional level where we're really seeing corruption being tackled head on by government so that we can get to a point where the macroeconomic environment broadly is conducive to investment?
I wish I could say there is a change. I wish I would say it is a great change, but you know what is interesting? When you look at a country like Equatorial Guinea, and a few years ago I looked at the per capita income of countries in the world, and Equatorial Guinea was using different measures, IMF or UN, was either on the same level as France or just below France. So it was in the top 10. But Equatorial Guinea is one of the poorest countries on the continent. So that means that the wealth of that country is only going to a few. And that only tells me that there's a lot of corruption happening in that country. So we need to be very realistic about what is happening. We know we have numbers that prove that we are producing X amount of, let's say, minerals, and yet why are we still having poverty? Why do we still have this huge population of African countries that are below $2 or people still below the $2 line? So we need to start really being we need to question, and we need to stop corruption, because
let me let you go on to the agricultural response before I get to Mabutho to also get his take on it.
We have great potential in agriculture. If you look at South Africa, agriculture is actually declining as a contribution to GDP, and that's because there is underinvestment in it. And I think also talking about youth and youth involvement, if you look at the South African case, there's an oligopolistic nature of the South African industries. And when a company that sells bread owns the entire supply chain, that is a problem. And so that, for me, is my huge problem with agriculture in the country, is that when the silos, when the farmers, the farms and the silos and everything else is owned by a company that produces bread, that means that people cannot compete in that space.
We could have a whole conversation about value chain financing in agriculture, all for another day. But Mabutho, let's get your take on this agricultural question, and whether this is a lever that could actually see active participation of young people as entrepreneurs, as well as meeting many of our macroeconomic objectives.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I think there needs to be substantial investment in that sector. We know for a fact that in the past, I think our economy was, producing a lot more from an agricultural perspective, but that has declined over the past few years. And what needs to happen is that young people also need to identify opportunities that lie in that sector and explore those opportunities. But also, I mean, it's a quid pro quo. So the government as well needs to, put in place measures to ensure that it supports the young people. From my understanding, there's actually a lot of land in this country which is unused, which is productive land. And therefore, I think the government needs to make that land available to young people, and young people also need to get together and start exploring that land, and also then the government help them in terms of access to markets and all other challenges that are faced in that sector.
I want to rephrase the question that was directly posed to you about how do we get in touch with you, because I'm sure you can do that with an exchange of a business card. But maybe let's talk about some of the strategies that you're observing on the ground that are working, that are supporting young entrepreneurs. Yeah.
I think from my end, I must commend my brother there for the commendable work that he's doing in his community. But I think what I've sort of identified in this space of youth leadership development, where we are focusing on as Youth Managers Foundation, is that there is a lot of potential that lies in young people. But the reality is that the quality of education in our country, we've mentioned it numerous times before, We also have issues of the structure of our economy, structural issues due to the to the era of apartheid and so forth. But the reality is that we as professionals need to play a very meaningful role in terms of going back to our communities and supporting the young people that are there in those communities. And we must be mindful of the fact that they are not getting exposed to anything else other than the social ills that exist in those communities. And if we let that status quo continue, then we are going to be faced with a situation where young people are dropped out and where young people are actually indulging in social ills that are currently a problem in our country. So it is therefore important that as professionals, with the experience that we have amassed in terms of our exposure in the public and the private sector, we go back to the communities and start planting the seed so that we develop those young people who are actually in the dark.
Development of young people who are actually in the dark, and of course the earlier comment that was made, and that is young people positioning themselves as active change catalysts in the communities within which they find themselves in. And that's how we wrap up tonight's episode. Thank you for making the time to join us. Please don't forget to send us your comments. The details are on the screen. But for now, Bruce Whitfield is standing by to bring you Tonight with Bruce. For myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye.